It was just after midnight when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I'd been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events over in my head. Rachel was at her friend's house for dinner, again. Mike, her old friend from college. The name alone had started to sound like nails on a chalkboard. I grabbed the phone, expecting another pointless email from work, but what I saw instead made my heart stop. An anonymous message. No subject, just a string of attachments. I opened the first one. And there it was. Rachel and Mike, sitting together at a dimly lit restaurant, their hands intertwined across the table like two people without a care in the world. The next photo was worse, her lips grazing his cheek, and the smile on his face, like he'd won some kind of prize. My stomach churned, but I stayed calm. Calm was all I had left. I could feel the rage building inside me, begging to explode, but I pushed it down. Emotion wasn't going to help me now. This was about control, and I had just been handed the one thing that could put everything back in my hands: proof. They thought they were clever, slipping away to have their private moments. But now, they were in my sights. I got up, walked to the window, and stared out at the city. The streetlights flickered below, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I felt a strange kind of detachment, like I was watching everything unfold from a distance. Rachel, the woman I'd built my life with, had become a stranger. And Mike? He was about to learn what happens when you cross the wrong man. But not tonight. No, tonight was for planning. I sat back down, opened my laptop, and fired off a message to the best private investigator I knew. We need to talk. Urgent. They weren't going to get away with this. I'd make sure of that. The investigator didn't waste time. Within a week, I had a folder full of photos, videos, and text messages. I wasn't just guessing anymore, now I knew. The affair was real, and it had been going on for months. Every time Rachel had told me she was catching up with an old friend, she was slipping away to see Mike. The guy the first used to think was harmless, just another face from her past, had wormed his way into my life, thinking I wouldn't notice. I wasn't blind, I was just patient. I stared at the photos, each one a punch to the gut. Rachel and Mike met in parking lots, slipping into hotel rooms, acting like the world was theirs and I was too stupid to see it. They'd underestimated me. My hands tightened into fists. But I forced myself to breathe. I needed to stay sharp. This wasn't the time to confront her, not yet. If I played my cards right, I'd walk away with everything. She'd lose, and so would Mike. First, I had to protect myself legally. I started putting together a case. Being a lawyer, I knew the importance of timing. Rachel didn't need to know that I was planning to divorce her until it was too late for her to do anything about it. As long as I kept quiet, I could ensure she didn't take a dime more than I allowed. I spent nights reviewing the evidence, locking it all into place, organizing the texts, the photos, and the receipts from their little getaways. I wanted everything to be perfect when the time came. In my line of work, precision was everything, and I wasn't about to leave any loose ends. But my revenge wasn't just about the divorce. That was the first step. Mike had made this personal, and I wasn't going to let him walk away untouched. He had a cushy job and a circle of professional contacts who thought he was some kind of saint. All of that was about to come crashing down. I just needed to wait for the right moment, and when it came, I'd pull the rug right out from under him. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. Rachel was upstairs, probably asleep by now, blissfully unaware that her world was about to collapse. Patience, I told myself again. It was the one thing I had mastered over the years, and it was going to pay off. For now, all I had to do was watch and wait. The silence between Rachel and me grew heavier with each passing day. She acted as if nothing had changed, smiling that same smile she used to, telling me about her day with the same rehearsed warmth. She probably thought I was still in the dark, oblivious to what was happening under my own roof. But I had become an expert in playing along. It wasn't hard to feign ignorance when I knew every detail of her betrayal. I'd memorized the timestamps on her messages, the exact times she'd leave the house for her yoga classes that turned into hours with Mike. My evenings were no longer spent working on cases for clients. I had become my own client. The only case that mattered was making sure Rachel paid for what she'd done. I made sure to keep things normal, even going so far as to plan a weekend getaway, just the two of us. It was my way of keeping her off guard. The last thing I needed was her suspecting anything before I was ready. Rachel agreed, and I saw relief in her eyes. She probably thought it was a sign that I was still the clueless. loving husband. But that weekend trip wasn't for her, it was for me. I needed time to finalize my plans, and the further we were from Mike, the easier it was for me to concentrate. I spent the evenings with my phone, reviewing the investigators' reports, and making sure every detail was airtight. The divorce papers were almost ready, and soon, I would drop them in front of her like a bomb. I could have confronted her any day, really, but that would have been too easy. Too clean. I wanted her to think everything was fine until the very last second. It was all about control, and I was in control now. With the divorce preparations nearing completion, I turned my attention to Mike. Rachel wasn't the only one who deserved to suffer. If anything, he was more to blame. He knew she was married, knew what he was doing, and had the audacity to think he could just carry on like nothing mattered. Mike was a well-known figure in his company, a marketing executive with a decent reputation. He had built a network of colleagues who trusted him, who probably had no idea what kind of person he really was. That was about to change. I had spent weeks researching Mike's workplace, learning about his bosses and the internal politics of the company. It was easy to find cracks in his professional armor. No one was perfect, not even Mike. He had a history of pushing boundaries, flirting with female coworkers, and making careless remarks in meetings. It was the kind of behavior that hadn't gotten him into trouble yet, but it made him vulnerable. I started by planting seeds. At a networking event, I casually introduced myself to a few people from his company, dropping subtle hints about how close Mike and Rachel had been lately. I didn't give them specifics, just enough to make them wonder. I could see the curiosity in their eyes, the slow burn of suspicion taking root. But the real blow would come from the emails. I had everything ready. A detailed, anonymous email containing pictures of Mike and Rachel's affair, along with some of the more incriminating texts. The kind of material that couldn't be ignored. I made sure the emails were crafted perfectly, professional enough to make it seem like a concerned colleague had sent them, but damning enough to destroy his reputation. One by one, I sent the emails to his coworkers, his superiors, and the HR department. Within hours, the ripple effect would begin, and Mike's life would start to unravel. I imagined him sitting at his desk when the first email arrived, opening it with that smug grin of his, only to have it wiped off his face when he realized what it was. The rest would come in waves. Whispers in the hallway, side glances from his coworkers, the sudden coldness of his boss calling him in for a talk. I didn't need to be there to see it. I could already picture it in my mind. By the time I was done with him, Mike wouldn't just lose Rachel. He'd lose everything. It was a Tuesday evening when I decided it was time. Rachel was home early, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine, flipping through some magazine like it was any other night. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, wondering if she had any idea how close the end was. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, looking up with a small smile as if we were still the perfect couple. I walked over, sat down across from her, and placed the folder of evidence on the coffee table between us. Her smile faltered. "What's that?" she asked, her voice suddenly uneasy. I didn't say a word. I just flipped open the folder, revealing the photos, text message screenshots, and hotel receipts. Her face drained of color as her eyes scanned the contents. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can explain." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice calm and cold. "There's nothing to explain. It's all right here. Every lie, every secret, every time you thought you were clever enough to hide it." She stared at me, tears welling up in her eyes. But the sight of her crying didn't move me like it once might have. I was beyond that now. "I'm filing for divorce," I said simply, pulling the papers from the folder and sliding them across the table. "These are ready to go. I'll make it easy for you. Sign them, and this doesn't have to get ugly." Rachel's hand shook as she reached for the papers. She flipped through them, her eyes wide with shock. "Lucas, she began, but I cut her off again. "You made your choice," I said, standing up. "Now, you can live with it." I walked to the door, leaving her sitting there, stunned and broken. The house was quiet as I grabbed my jacket and headed out, not bothering to look back. I didn't feel anything. No anger, no sadness. Just the cold satisfaction of knowing that my plan was finally in motion. She wasn't the only one who would pay for this. The fallout from the emails hit Mike harder than I expected. By the end of the week, he had been called into his boss's office, not just once, but twice. The second time, he didn't come back out for nearly an hour. I had my contacts feeding me information from inside the company. And from what I heard, things were unraveling fast. The first email had been enough to make people talk. The second and third sealed his fate. HR launched an investigation into his behavior, not just because of the affair, but because I'd also attached some of his inappropriate remarks from office gatherings. It didn't take much to paint a picture of Mike as someone who was reckless, untrustworthy, and a liability. I imagined how it must have felt for him, watching his career crumble while trying to hold on to Rachel, who was already starting to lose her grip on her own life. From what I'd heard, she had tried reaching out to him, but he was too wrapped up in his own problems to care anymore. Good. Let them both drown. By the end of the month, Mike was suspended from work pending a full review. His name was already being whispered in every corner of the office, and his colleagues had begun to distance themselves. No one wanted to be associated with the guy whose personal life had blown up so publicly. Especially not in a company that thrived on reputation. One night, as I sat in my new apartment, I received a call from one of my contacts in the company. They fired him, the voice on the other end said. It's all over for him. HR finished the investigation, and it didn't look good. They're not even giving him a chance to resign. I hung up the phone and stared at the city lights outside my window. I thought I'd feel some kind of triumph, some deep sense of victory. After all, I had gotten exactly what I wanted. Mike was jobless, his career in ruins, and Rachel? She was left with nothing but the wreckage of her own choices. But as I sat there, in the quiet of my apartment, I realized something. The revenge wasn't as sweet as I thought it would be. Sure, I had destroyed their lives, but mine felt hollow in the aftermath. It was as though every step I took had left me further and further from who I used to be. I had won, but at what cost? The final collapse of Rachel's life came faster than I had anticipated. After I served her the divorce papers, she tried to reach out to Mike, but by then, he was drowning in his own mess. She had no idea that I had systematically destroyed his career from the inside. All she knew was that Mike stopped answering her calls, and her once secure life with me was rapidly slipping away. She didn't take long to start panicking. I could see it in her eyes, in the way she moved around the house, unsure of where to turn. She tried to talk to me a few times, but I made it clear that I was done. Each conversation was short, cold, and to the point. I no longer had any interest in her excuses or explanations. She signed the divorce papers after a week of silence. I had left them on the kitchen counter for her, and one evening when I came home, they were there, signed, her name looking small and defeated on the page. Part of me expected her to fight, to demand more in the settlement, or to try and negotiate her way out of this, but she didn't. I think she knew she'd lost. Within days, I had my lawyer file the documents, and just like that, our marriage was over. Rachel moved out of the house not long after, and the silence that followed was unsettling. I had won. I had stripped her of everything, but as I looked around the empty house, I began to wonder if winning was really what I wanted. The rooms felt hollow, the echo of every footstep a reminder of what once was. Our life together, the memories, the plans we had made, it all seemed meaningless now. But there was no going back. I had chosen this path, and I wasn't about to regret it. Rachel had betrayed me, and she deserved every bit of what she got. As for Mike, I had heard rumors that he was struggling to find work. His reputation was stained, and no company in their right mind would hire him. He had become untouchable. It was what I wanted, wasn't it? Months passed. I settled into my new life as a single man, moving into a smaller apartment downtown and throwing myself into work. The divorce was finalized quickly. Thanks to Rachel's lack of fight, I had managed to keep most of our assets, while she walked away with barely anything. But the satisfaction I had expected never came. I thought destroying their lives would feel like a victory, but instead, I felt empty. Mike was jobless, Rachel was alone, and I had walked away with everything I wanted. Yet, in the quiet moments, I couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that something was missing. I had spent so long focusing on revenge, on tearing them down, that I hadn't thought about what would come after. One day, I found myself walking through the old neighborhood where Rachel and I used to live. The house we had shared was up for sale, the for sale sign swaying in the wind. I stood there for a long time, staring at the windows where we used to sit together and laugh together. I didn't miss her, but I missed the life we had before it all fell apart. I heard through mutual friends that Rachel had tried to reach out to Mike one last time. But he had already left town, too humiliated to stay. She was on her own now, living in a cheap apartment, working a job that barely paid the bills. Mike, on the other hand, had gone off the grid, likely hiding from the mess his life had become. I thought about them both, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger. Just indifference. Revenge had consumed me, driven me to destroy their lives, but what I had gained was nothing more than a temporary satisfaction. The truth was, I had become someone I didn't recognize. The man who used to love Rachel, who believed in trust and loyalty, was gone. In his place was someone who had let bitterness define him. That night, I sat by the window of my apartment, looking out at the city lights below. I had achieved everything I set out to do. Rachel's betrayal had been avenged, Mike's career ruined. But now, I was left to live with the consequences of my own actions. Winning had never felt so hollow. Weeks turned into months, and life around me moved forward. But I felt stuck. I couldn't shake the emptiness that had settled in since my plan reached its brutal conclusion. People congratulated me on moving on or getting past it, but they didn't know the full story. To them, I was just the guy who went through a bad divorce and came out on top. They didn't know the lengths I had gone to, the games I played to destroy Rachel and Mike. I had ruined their lives, but it hadn't fixed mine. One afternoon, as I sat in my office at the firm, a familiar face walked in, Greg. An old friend of mine. He knew about the divorce, but we hadn't spoken in months. After some small talk, he looked at me and said, "You don't seem like yourself, Lucas." What happened? Really? I stared at him for a long moment. I hadn't told anyone the full story. The details of my revenge stayed locked away, a private victory I thought I would savor. But now, as Greg looked at me with genuine concern, I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. "I won," I finally said. My voice sounded cold and detached. "I got everything I wanted." Greg frowned, clearly not understanding. "What do you mean? What did you get?" I could see the confusion in his eyes, and suddenly, the whole thing felt ridiculous. This revenge, this grand plan that I had built up in my mind, it was hollow. A shallow victory that had cost me more than I realized. I had lost a piece of myself in the process. "I got them back for what they did," I said quietly. But it didn't change anything. Greg didn't say anything for a moment. He just sat there, letting my words sink in. Then, he asked a question I hadn't expected. "Do you feel better?" The truth was, I didn't. I had convinced myself that revenge would bring closure, but instead, it had opened a wound that wouldn't heal. It was like a fire that had burned through my life, leaving nothing but ashes behind. "No," I admitted. "I don't." Greg leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "That's the thing about revenge, man. It always feels good in the moment, but it never fills the void." His words hit me harder than I expected. I had spent so long focused on Rachel and Mike, so consumed by anger, that I hadn't stopped to consider what came next. Now that they were both gone, I was left with nothing but a hollow victory. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The weight of what I'd done, the decisions I'd made, settled into place, and I knew I couldn't keep living like this. It was time to move on, for real this time. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in what felt like years, I didn't feel the anger, the bitterness, or the desire for revenge. I felt free. I went through my day as usual, work, meetings, emails, but something had shifted. The lingering thoughts of Rachel and Mike no longer held the power they once did. Their absence, once a source of satisfaction, had lost its meaning. I realized now that holding onto the past, onto the idea of revenge, had only trapped me in a cycle I couldn't escape. Later that evening, I found myself standing outside our old house, the one Rachel and I had shared. The for sale sign was still there, the house was still vacant. I hadn't been back since the divorce, but something pulled me there now. I walked up to the front porch, the memories of our life together flashing through my mind. I didn't hate her anymore. Not like I used to. She had made her choices, and so had I. But I wasn't angry about it anymore. I had done what I thought was necessary, but I realized now that holding onto that anger had been worse than anything she had done to me. I stood there for a long time, watching the sun set behind the house, casting long shadows across the yard. The life we had, the plans we made, it was all gone now. But that was okay. It had taken me a long time to get here, but I finally understood. Letting go wasn't about forgiving Rachel. It wasn't about undoing what had happened. It was about freeing myself from the weight of it all. As I turned to leave, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't carrying the burden of what had happened between us. I wasn't defined by the revenge I had plotted or the pain of her betrayal. I was ready to start again. The next morning, I called my lawyer to close the final chapter of the divorce. It was over now, not just legally, but emotionally. Rachel and Mike were no longer my concerns. They had their own lives to deal with, and so did I. The weight of revenge was gone, and in its place was something new, a chance to rebuild, to move forward. And this time, I wouldn't be looking back. The process of rebuilding my life wasn't immediate, but it felt liberating. I stopped thinking about Rachel and Mike altogether. They had become distant memories, like echoes of a past that no longer mattered. For the first time in a long time, I began to think about what I wanted for myself, not as some form of revenge, but as a step toward genuine happiness. I started by refocusing on my work. Being a lawyer had always been a part of my identity, but during the months of plotting and executing my revenge, I'd lost my passion for it. Now, I threw myself back into my cases, this time with a different mindset. I wasn't just going through the motions anymore. I was there, fully present, giving everything my best shot. My colleagues noticed the change, and soon enough, so did my clients. The real surprise came when I was offered a promotion. The managing partner pulled me into his office one afternoon and said, "Lucas, we've been watching you lately. Your work has been outstanding. We want you to take on a bigger role here." I felt a sense of pride I hadn't felt in a long time. Not the cold satisfaction of revenge, but real pride. For once, I was being recognized for my hard work, not for outsmarting or manipulating someone. It was a feeling I could actually appreciate, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to be proud of who I was becoming. Outside of work, I reconnected with friends. People I had neglected while I was drowning in my vendetta. Some of them welcomed me back with open arms, while others were more cautious, unsure of where I stood after everything that had happened. I didn't blame them. I had changed, and it took time for them to see the new version of me, the one who wasn't consumed by bitterness and anger. It was a slow process, but every day I felt a little lighter. The darkness that had clouded my mind for so long was lifted, replaced by a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I found myself in a place I never thought I'd be: content. It wasn't the kind of contentment that came from having everything figured out, but more of a quiet understanding that life didn't need to be perfect to be fulfilling. One evening, while I was out grabbing dinner at a new restaurant downtown, I bumped into an old friend, Jessica, someone I had known from law school. We hadn't spoken in years, but seeing her brought back a flood of memories from a time when things were simpler, when I hadn't yet become the person who sought revenge. "Lucas, I can't believe it's you," she said, her smile warm and genuine. We caught up over drinks, reminiscing about our law school days and how much life had changed since then. She had moved to the city a few years ago, built her own legal practice, and was thriving. It was refreshing to talk to someone who hadn't been a part of the mess with Rachel and Mike, someone who saw me for who I used to be, and who I was becoming again. As the night went on, I realized something. For the first time in a long while, I was looking forward. Not back. I wasn't replaying old memories or plotting anyone's downfall. I was living in the present, enjoying a conversation with an old friend, and it felt good. Simple, but good. By the time I left the restaurant, I had her number saved in my phone, and we made plans to meet up again. It wasn't a date, not yet at least, but it felt like the beginning of something new. Something that wasn't clouded by anger or revenge. That night, as I walked back to my apartment, I realized just how much had changed. I had let go of the need to control everything, to punish those who had wronged me. Rachel and Mike were no longer part of my life, and I didn't care what happened to them anymore. They had their own paths to walk, just like I had mine. I wasn't the man I used to be, the one who let betrayal consume him, who let anger dictate every decision. I was different now, stronger, more focused, and most importantly, free. As I unlocked the door to my apartment and stepped inside, I glanced at the city skyline through the window. For the first time in a long time, the future felt open, full of possibilities. I wasn't just moving on. I was moving forward, and for the first time, that felt like enough. Life after Rachel felt like I had crossed some invisible line, a barrier separating the old me from the man I was now. It wasn't just about letting go of her and the bitterness that came with it, it was about truly starting over. Jessica and I kept in touch, and our casual meetings turned into more frequent dinners. Long walks and conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. It felt easy with her, no hidden agendas, no resentment, just two people reconnecting after years apart. There was something refreshing about being with someone who knew me before everything had fallen apart, someone who reminded me of who I used to be before I was consumed by anger and revenge. One evening, after one of our usual dinners, we found ourselves sitting on a park bench overlooking the river. The city lights reflected off the water, and there was a calm silence between us. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. Jessica turned to me, her expression soft but serious. "Lucas," she began, "I know you've been through a lot. I don't know all the details, and I don't need to. But I can see how much you've changed, how far you've come." Her words struck a chord. I had been so focused on what I lost and the revenge I sought that I hadn't fully realized how far I distanced myself from the person I used to be. "I'm still figuring things out," I admitted, looking out at the river. "But for the first time, I'm not haunted by the past." She smiled, reaching for my hand. "That's all anyone can ask for, really. Moving forward, not getting stuck in what's behind us." Her hand in mine felt like a lifeline, pulling me further into this new chapter of my life. And for the first time, I felt ready to embrace it fully, without looking back. We didn't need to rush anything. We were both content to let things unfold naturally. But I could sense something deeper growing between us. It wasn't just friendship anymore. It was more than that, something I hadn't expected but welcomed all the same. Months passed, and my life continued to evolve. Work was steady, friendships were being rebuilt, and Jessica had become a constant presence in my life. Our relationship grew naturally, without the chaos or drama that had defined my time with Rachel. It was easy, effortless, the kind of relationship I hadn't realized I was missing all along. One day, as I sat in my office reviewing case files, an email notification appeared on my screen. The subject line read, "Rachel Green Final Settlement." It was a notification from my lawyer, confirming that all loose ends of the divorce had been officially tied up. The sale of our old house had gone through, and any remaining financial matters were now fully resolved. It was the final step, the true ending of our story. I stared at the email for a moment, feeling a mix of emotions. Relief, mostly. A sense of closure I hadn't anticipated. There was no more Rachel, no more ties to that chapter of my life. I could move on without the weight of unfinished business. But there was something else, a subtle curiosity. What had become of her? I hadn't heard anything about Rachel since the divorce, and frankly, I hadn't cared. But now that everything was officially over, I couldn't help but wonder. Later that evening, I mentioned the email to Jessica. We were sitting in my apartment, sharing a bottle of wine, when I brought it up. "I got an email today. It's done, Rachel, the house, everything. It's all over." Jessica nodded thoughtfully, sipping her wine. "How do you feel about that?" "I'm relieved, mostly," I said. "But part of me wonders what happened to her. I know it doesn't matter, but..." Jessica smiled softly. "It's natural to wonder. She was a big part of your life, and now that door is finally closed. But the important thing is that you're in a better place now." She was right. Whatever had happened to Rachel wasn't my concern anymore. I had spent too long letting her affair and the fallout of it define me. But that chapter was over, and I had written the ending. Now it was time to focus on what came next. As I sat there with Jessica, the last threads of my past slipping away, I felt a new sense of peace wash over me. The life I had now was different from what I'd imagined before everything had fallen apart, but in many ways, it was better. More authentic, more real. I was no longer the man chasing revenge, nor was I the husband whose life had been shattered by betrayal. I was just Lucas, a man who had made mistakes, learned from them, and come out stronger on the other side. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel uncertain or bleak. It felt like an open road, and I was ready to walk it, one step at a time, with Jessica by my side. And this time, I knew I wouldn't need to look back. A year had passed since the divorce was finalized. And I found myself in a place I never thought I'd reach, completely free from the weight of the past. The fragments of my old life with Rachel, the anger, the obsession with revenge, had all dissipated like smoke, leaving behind a calm I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't an overnight transformation, nor had it been easy, but somewhere along the way, I had let go. The day began like any other, a quiet Saturday morning. The muted sounds of the city drifted in through the open window of my apartment, mixing with the smell of fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen. Jessica was already up, humming to herself as she poured us both cups. I watched her from across the room, a smile playing at the corners of my mouth. She was a steady presence in my life now, a source of warmth and light that contrasted sharply with the cold bitterness of my past. Jessica noticed me watching and turned, a knowing smile on her face. "What's on your mind, Lucas?" she asked, her voice gentle as she handed me my coffee. I took the mug from her, savoring the warmth in my hands before answering. "I was just thinking about how different everything is now. How far things have come in a year." Her eyes softened as she sat down beside me, her hand resting on my knee. "You've been through a lot, but look at where you are now. It's not just different, it's better." She was right, of course. The man I had become over the past year was a far cry from the man who had been consumed by thoughts of revenge. That man had let anger and betrayal define him, allowing Rachel's infidelity and Mike's involvement to take up space in every corner of his mind. Now, it all felt like a distant dream, something that had happened to someone else, in a life that no longer resembled my own. "I think I've finally let go," I admitted, my voice quiet but sure. "Rachel, Mike, the betrayal, it doesn't matter anymore. It's over. For real this time." It was a declaration that had been long in the making, but I knew deep down it was true. I had moved on from the pain and the anger, and I no longer felt the need to hold on to the past. Rachel and Mike had made their choices, and I had made mine. I had chosen to let them go, to release the weight of their actions and focus on my own future. Jessica leaned her head on my shoulder, her presence grounding me. "I'm proud of you, you know. Letting go isn't easy, but you did it. You've come so far." I smiled at her words, the weight of them settling over me like a comforting blanket. Letting go had been a process, slow, deliberate, but ultimately freeing. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened, it was about accepting it and choosing not to let it define me anymore. I had spent too long with my mind shackled to the idea of revenge, thinking that hurting Rachel and Mike would bring me some kind of closure. But the truth was, revenge had only delayed my healing. Now, in this new chapter of my life, I felt lighter, like a man reborn. The day unfolded as planned. We had a brunch scheduled with a group of friends. The kind of casual gathering that had once seemed impossible when I was tangled in the mess of my divorce. Back then, every social interaction had felt like a reminder of what I had lost, of the life I had built with Rachel that had crumbled so suddenly. But now, gatherings like this were something I looked forward to, a way to celebrate the new connections I had forged and the friendships that had endured. As Jessica and I got ready to leave, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. I was no longer the man whose life had been derailed by betrayal. I was Lucas, a lawyer, a friend, someone who had been through hell and come out stronger. My career was flourishing again, my relationships were stronger than ever, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was living for myself, not for anyone else. Before we left the apartment, I received one last email notification. It was from my lawyer, a final confirmation that the last of the financial matters from my divorce had been settled. Rachel was officially out of my life. No more shared assets, no lingering ties. The email felt like the final piece of the puzzle, the last step in truly closing the door on that chapter. I showed Jessica the email, and she smiled knowingly. "So it's really done now. How does it feel?" I thought about it for a moment before replying. "It feels good. Not the way I thought it would, but good. I don't feel any bitterness or anger. Just relief. It's over." Jessica nodded, her hand slipping into mine. "You deserve that peace, Lucas." As we left the apartment and stepped into the cool autumn air, I felt a deep sense of closure wash over me. Not just with Rachel, but with everything that had come with her, Mike, the anger, the revenge, the pain. I was free now, truly free, and for the first time in years, I was looking forward, not backward. The brunch with friends was lighthearted and fun, filled with laughter and conversation that flowed effortlessly. I realized, sitting there among people who cared about me, that I had rebuilt my life in a way that felt authentic and fulfilling. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was mine. The bitterness that had once colored every moment was gone, replaced by a quiet contentment that came from knowing I had survived the storm and come out stronger on the other side. After brunch, Jessica and I took a walk through the park. The leaves were turning shades of orange and red, a sign that autumn was in full swing. As we strolled, hand in hand, I couldn't help but feel grateful for her. For my friends, for the life I had now. It wasn't the life I had imagined when I married Rachel, but it was better. It was honest, grounded in real connections and experiences, not illusions or false promises. As we walked, Jessica turned to me with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever think about where they are now? Rachel and Mike? I considered the question for a moment, then shook my head. Not really. I don't care anymore. They're not part of my life, and they never will be again. I've moved on. I don't need to know what happens to them. Jessica smiled at my answer, her grip on my hand tightening slightly. I'm glad. You deserve so much more than what they gave you. I nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over me. She was right. I did deserve more. And for the first time, I was living a life that reflected that. A life that wasn't defined by betrayal or revenge, but by the choices I made for myself. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, I realized something profound. The past was behind me, locked away where it belonged. The future, on the other hand, was wide open, full of possibilities I couldn't have imagined a year ago. I didn't know exactly where the road ahead would lead, but I knew one thing for certain: I was ready for it. And whatever came next, I would face it with the confidence of a man who had survived the worst and come out stronger. This was my life now, and I was finally at peace with it. No more anger, no more revenge, just a clean slate, and the freedom to write my own story from here on out. And this time, it would be a story worth living.